Good morning, Steven.
Good morning, Kevin.
Well, you know what we're going to talk about, the same as we always talk about. It just gets worse every day, doesn't it? But, you know, the Bibby Stockholm barge lies there, a rusting, empty hulk, somehow an image of this disintegrating mess of a migrant crisis. None of the RAF bases can be used for migrants that they hope to because of local protests. Meanwhile, of course, commandeering hotels continues apace. And this week, in a terrible story, I would suggest, we learned that 168 students at Huddersfield University who had all their accommodation, their official uni accommodation sorted out for next term, which begins later this month, of course. They've been booted out to make way for asylum seekers. That sums up the desperation of this situation, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and it shows the people who are often seen to be the biggest supporters of the Migrants Welcome movement, that they too are not immune from being put behind the interests of the people smugglers' business. And quite frankly, we've seen in Yorkshire, housing accommodation built for local tenants and the local communities being used for Afghan applicants who've come across on the Afghan scheme before those who haven't got housing being allowed to have it themselves. We've seen the growth of the business, in particular around Stoke, of the large companies making millions from accommodation, trying to buy up all the short tenancies, and thus shortening the amount of market space available for local communities in the northwest, and now housing for students. We have a mess in this country and now we see in housing the people of this country being put behind the needs of those who are the people smugglers' business model.
Does Rishi Sunak, I think it was a few months back, wasn't it, March, I believe, when he stood there boldly behind his lectern with the words "Stop the boats" written on the front. Does he stand a snowball's chance in hell of stopping the boats anytime soon, more pertinently before the next election? Without wishing to preempt your answer, Stephen, I would say the answer to that question is a resolute no.
The answer is now an absolute no. Unfortunately, I was a keen supporter of the plans for Rwanda, but recognised they would be challenged in the courts. I also felt that there was a need to put camps across the country where those large numbers, 20,000 plus this year, would be placed rather than housing in the local communities. But we've seen a combination of court cases, attempts by the House of Lords, restrictions by those working senior levels of civil servants we're aware of now, attempting to prevent any restriction of housing for other than being sent into local communities for those who are coming across on the boats. And I don't think he's got a chance now this year to be able to stop it, or indeed before next year's election.
The barge down in Portland, which lies there, of course, sort of symbol of everything that's going wrong. At one point, there's supposed to be 509 young male migrants on board. They were supposed to start boarding about a month ago now. Of course, we got as many as 38 on board before they were all taken off due to various threats of fire, hazards, and then, of course, the Legionnaires' disease scare. Now, I think it was earlier this week, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, said, well, that's all fixed. We've fixed the water system, no more Legionnaires' disease. There is actually no official warning that this is a fire safety. They say, oh, the firefighters have warned the Home Secretary that this is a fire hazard. No, they haven't. The Fire Brigade Union have warned the Home Secretary. That is different to the Fire Brigade. So politically motivated union members have warned her this is a fire hazard, a floating Grenfell. It didn't once catch fire in 50 years before it got to Portland, but there you go. Now, she says, though, it's ready to roll. It's ready to roll. We can put them back on. Well, go on then, Suella. Start putting them on. What's going on? Why is it sitting there empty?
Well, I can only assume they're either waiting A, for a good moment when they can give a good piece of PR, or B, behind the scenes, there's something else that's trying to prevent them from putting people on right away. We'd have needed another 4 Bibbies anyway, just to house those that had arrived over last week. But Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak have a much bigger problem to worry about, really, Kevin, when it comes to the whole of migration into the UK. Last year, a city the size of Coventry, which is the 11th largest city in the United Kingdom, arrived in the UK. 175,000 people were granted the right to remain. Only 20,000 of them were under the Refugee Convention. They had the Afghans, the Hong Kongs, and the Ukrainians. We had 164,000 dependents for those arriving who are students. We had 115,000 people who are dependents for those arriving on work visas. We had 64,000 people came across just as family reunion visas. The whole of the immigration system is built upon now bringing over 1 million people and 5 million people increase in population in 10 years. The question is, can Britain cope with now being the most dense, England cope with being the most dense country in Europe? Can we cope on infrastructure, housing, hospitals, schools? And can any of the government or the opposition parties provide us with a plan for the 2 million that are expected in the next 5 years?
Yeah, the most dense country in Europe, well, arguably with the most dense government as well. I mean, as I say, this is just spinning out of control and nothing seems to be done. I mean, what could we do? I always ask you this question. My solution would be start flying them to Rwanda now, do what all the other European countries do, break the European Convention on Human Rights laws, and then come back to the ECHR afterwards when they can't really do anything about it. So I say take off and or start turning the boats round. We keep hearing, if you turn the boats round and you take them back to front, that's really, really, really dangerous. But apparently, if you don't turn them around, but you do exactly the same thing in the opposite direction, you help them continue their journey to Britain, that's not dangerous. Riddle me that, Stephen.
Well, they're both dangerous. It's both dangerous getting into a boat, particularly at this time of year now, when the weather's changing, and it's dangerous being able to try and cross the channel. So, quite frankly, isn't it easier to try and transport them when they're closest to the coast? You have the law of the sea, SOLAS, that gives the government the opportunity to do so. It's the Foreign Office that's preventing the British government from undertaking such an action because they say it's going to upset the French and upset Europe. It probably would. We certainly know it would upset the French, but it's something you can do. You could take the route that you suggested, would start flying them out to Rwanda and looking at other areas such as the Ascension Island and moving them quickly into camps. You could, as we've joked about many, many times, when the King has suggested that we should be welcome to refugees. Well, he's got an estate in Scotland the size of Liverpool. You could build a camp on his estate and put them all there. So there are options out there. Internationally, I do believe we should have a convention now that really talks about how we amend the UN Refugee Convention to exclude anyone that comes across for economic migrancy and exclude the requirements for legal aid and housing costs.
Absolutely. I like the idea of building a huge camp on Prince Charles's or King Charles's land. Let's do that, see how he likes it. Stephen, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Steven Woolfe.